During my playthrough of Dark Cloud and its sequel, Dark Cloud 2, I kept asking myself, why am I playing a 20-year-old game? We are currently at the start of a brand new console generation, I finally have a nice gaming computer, and there are tons of newer games I could be putting time and effort into. But I'm sort of obsessed with this series and I've wanted to make videos on them ever since I started my channel. By the end of Dark Cloud 2, I did answer my question as to why I wanted to make a video on these two games. Whether we like it or not, reboots, remasters, reimaginings, remakes, and sequels are a big part of video games, and I can't imagine that's going away anytime soon. If somebody asked me what game franchise I'd want to see revived, Dark Cloud would be my answer. Dark Cloud 1 and 2 are games with a ton of great ideas and potential. The key word here is potential. I want to explore these two games and talk about the potential that was there in the early 2000s and is still here in 2021. Let's start with Dark Cloud 1. The beginning of Dark Cloud is about as early 2000s video game as you can get. An evil nation uses an ancient ritual to revive the Dark Genie, an immensely powerful and nefarious being. Why? Well, why else? To take over the world. Immediately after the ritual scene is complete, we're introduced to our hero of the story, which you can name yourself, but the game gives him the name Toan. Toan is just your average 14-year-old boy hanging out in his small village getting ready for the festival. I'm sure you know where this is going. The festival gets interrupted by the Dark Genie, who proceeds to annihilate the village. Once the dust is settled, Toan wakes up to find he was rescued by the Fairy King. The Fairy King informs Toan he's the chosen wielder of the Atlamillia and must now go on a quest to stop the Dark Genie and save the world. As basic as this setup is, the game pulls it off. It's kind of cute and charming in a way. Before the opening begins, a narrator tells the player that what we're playing is a tale from an old storybook. In this fourth wall breaking moment, the narrator tells us they're unsure on whether or not any of this actually happened or if it's just a story made up by Toan. I will admit I may be overthinking this a bit, but that opening line stuck with me throughout my playthrough. Not whether or not any of it's real, of course not, I'm playing a video game, but rather the idea of how the story is told, through the perspective of a young boy going on an incredible adventure. Things may be embellished and more fantastical and corny than what they actually are because we're playing that childhood storybook. But let's switch gears here for a bit. Although I find Dark Cloud's story fine, it certainly hasn't aged well compared to modern game standards and not really what makes this game stick out for me. Let's talk about the gameplay. Dark Cloud's gameplay can be split up into three parts. It's an action RPG dungeon crawler, a city builder, and a survival game. Due to video game logic, everything the Dark Genie destroyed was actually saved and put into little orbs. Those orbs were then placed nearby for Toan to find using the Atlamillia. Again, due to video game logic, all of these orbs just so happen to be placed nearby in a hostile area or dungeon he'll need to fight through. The gameplay loop is pretty simple. First is the prep stage. Dungeons are dangerous and the last thing you want is to be halfway through a floor and run out of supplies. In Dark Cloud, you need to bring a good amount of food, water, medicine, and repair powder for your weapons if you wish to make meaningful progression. Second is the action stage. You're in the dungeon fighting enemies and looking for those orbs. Two things are required to progress through the dungeon, a key to get to the next floor and all the orbs on the current floor. Third and final is the city building. Once you've made some progress, you can turn those orbs back into buildings and people to recreate the destroyed areas even better than they were before. This is one of those moments with potential I wanted to talk about with Dark Cloud. It came out in Japan at the tail end of 2000 and released in the States in 2001. But what I just described to you is a pretty modern day survival gameplay template. In survival games now, you typically set up a base of operations, go out to the world, collect supplies, fight enemies, and bring it all back to your home base and build it up further. This was years before the survival game craze, too. By modern standards, the survival elements of Dark Cloud are pretty light and can be downright annoying. In Dark Cloud, you have to watch a thirst meter and drink water to prevent becoming dehydrated. You eat food to restore health. You take the appropriate medicine for status effects. Is Dark Cloud the first ever survival game? Of course not. But Dark Cloud certainly has elements of survival gameplay within it. Having supplies and keeping track of thirst and status effects is just one element of the dungeon experience. Let's look at the actual combat and dungeon crawling. As I was writing this script, I was a bit curious to see what critics thought of Dark Cloud 20 years ago. I was surprised about what was written regarding the combat systems. A lot of critics at the time pointed towards Dark Cloud's combat reminding them of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. That's because both games use the Z-targeting or locking on as we know it today. Ocarina of Time came out just 2 years before Dark Cloud, and it does kind of make me laugh that there was a time where a combat system with lock-on targeting would be referred to as a Zelda-like and not a Souls-like. As you explore dungeons, you lock on to enemies, then you sort of do a little dance, deciding when you're going to attack. You attack, take a part of their health bar, and try to avoid getting hit yourself. It's pretty bare bones. Tons of cool enemy designs make up Dark Cloud's bestiary. There are of course your mainstays like skeletons, dragons, and cave bats, but there are tons more on offer. Werewolves, giant snakes, ghosts, golems, and much more. Because Dark Cloud wasn't a Zelda game that couldn't break up its combat with puzzles and exploration, I think enemy variety was one way to keep the combat fun and engaging. Dark Cloud also has 6 playable characters, each specializing in a unique weapon type to add even more variety to how the player approaches combat. Toan uses swords because he's the main character, and of course the main character uses swords. Goro, a pudgy hunter with daddy issues, uses giant hammers and axes that attack much slower than Toan's swords but typically do more damage. Zhao is a cat person that attacks at a range using a slingshot. Ruby, also a ranged character that shoots magic spells at enemies. Ruby can charge her shots up to do more damage but cannot use spells as quickly as Zhao can shoot her slingshot. Ungaga uses spears and has more range than both Toan and Goro, and his attack speed falls somewhere between them. And finally, Osmond flies around on a helicopter pack and uses guns. The last bit of variety the game adds to the combat is probably the coolest and most memorable thing about it, the weapon upgrade system. In Dark Cloud, characters don't level up. Instead, your weapons level up. Each time you kill a monster, the weapon gains experience points. Once your EXP gauge is filled, you can upgrade the weapon and fuse it with stones to increase the overall stats of the weapon. After a while, you can transform the weapon into an all-new one. I love to see games give the player a visual representation of character growth, especially in action RPGs. Sure, it's great to see skills being unlocked in bigger numbers, but nothing beats actually seeing it in the form of a weapon. With 6 characters, there are plenty of weapons and weapon types to choose from. It's also kind of personal. In other more modern games, you can find stronger weapons or craft them, but they will be replaced as soon as you find something better. In Dark Cloud, your weapons are game-long projects that grow as you play. In theory, you could find a weapon in Floor 1 on the first level and build it up to its max level in final form towards the end. Finally, there's the city building aspect of the game. After finding a bunch of those orbs in the area's respective dungeon, it's up to the player to rebuild that area. This is probably the most unique part about the Dark Cloud games. How it works in the first game is you collect parts for objects like houses and other buildings and put them back together. Once they're put together, you can place them on the map. This was the coolest thing as a kid. It was basically my first city builder. You get a reward after finishing each building, too. After rebuilding a few homes and bringing back the villagers, you can listen to their requests on how to build a town better than it was before, and if you fulfill all those requests, you get a bonus reward. From a player choice perspective, this is one of the best aspects of Dark Cloud. Not only are we saving the world, but we get to rebuild it. Even with the requests and requirements, you still have some agency to rebuild the towns how you want them built. Being a PS2 game that's primarily a dungeon crawler action RPG, you can probably guess that the town building aspect is rather limited, and I agree. But you have a ton of freedom with what's there. This also leads back to this idea of Dark Cloud having a ton of potential. Even in modern action RPG adventure hybrids with base building mechanics, they typically don't give the player a ton of choice on how they wish to rebuild. Usually it's grab the supplies needed, bring the supplies to the base, use those supplies to upgrade said base. From there, everything goes on autopilot. In Dark Cloud, though, you're the one flying the plane. And I mean, sure, all of this is basically aesthetic. It doesn't matter where you put the weapon shop in the town, but the point is you get to decide. Even though the city building is limited, I had fun deciding how I was going to make my perfect town while also keeping the citizens' wants and needs in mind. I wish more games would take influence from this aspect, especially now in 2021 where we could get a more fleshed out RPG city builder hybrid. Now that I've went over how the game works and its strengths, let's get back to the world story and soundtrack. The game is charming from start to finish. Each area and dungeon has a side story that intertwines with the main quest. This side story usually concludes with Toan befriending a new party member and restoring the town. All of the side stories are sort of plays on old fables and fairy tales, and I think it heightens my previously mentioned point of the game told through Toan's perspective. Level 2 has the classic story of a hunter getting ill but not wanting to die bedridden and goes on one last legendary hunt. Level 3 tells the story of a princess and a commoner running away to get married, but the princess is left abandoned at the altar and curses the town. Level 4 is a story about a brave warrior who failed at protecting his home and getting over his failure. They're all stories we're familiar with and have heard hundreds of times before, but I'm okay with that. Even the big bad Dark Genie is just a product of a man who wanted to protect his kingdom and made a deal with the devil to do so. All of these stories, of course, end well due to the intervention of our hero Toan. The world of Dark Cloud is a bit interesting to me, and we'll get into why a bit more when we move into talking about Dark Cloud 2, but there are some things I need to cover now. Dark Cloud 1 has a surprisingly fleshed out world for an original IP from the PS2 era. Each level has a different environment. We have the starting area small village where the hero grew up. There's of course the forest area, a merchant city by the sea, a tribal themed desert village. We even get to go to the moon and visit a futuristic laboratory. And it wouldn't be an epic adventure without the final battle in a dark evil looking castle. The towns are filled with interesting NPCs that typically have likable personalities. When rebuilding the areas destroyed by the Dark Genie, it did feel like I was rebuilding a community. Different backgrounds and races are pretty well represented too. I can tell love and care was put into the world to make it feel as alive and fun as a PS2 game could be. The soundtrack is wonderful. For the past 20 years I've had the Divine Beast Cave and Norune Village theme stuck in my head. The soundtrack adds to the adventure and changes to fit the overall vibe of the location. Admittedly, hearing the same theme for hours on end can get a little annoying, and when I was grinding out levels, I did have to mute it and throw on some music or a podcast, but the tunes themselves are pretty good. I just wish there was more of them to break up the endless loop. So I've talked about Dark Cloud's strengths and laid out why I think this game is good. Unfortunately, now I have to talk about its shortcomings. The reason I use the word potential is because most of the things I like about Dark Cloud have drawbacks. The potential was not fully realized. Some of these are just because it's a 20-year-old game, but some of them cannot be excused because the game is old. The worst part about Dark Cloud is how menu-heavy the gameplay is. When exploring dungeons, I found myself having to constantly go into the start menu for a certain item I needed. For instance, if your weapon is about to break, you'll need to hit triangle, go to either your item menu or weapon menu, select the weapon or item, and select the repair command, then back out of the two menus. You have to do this a lot, and it was enough to test my patience throughout the game. You do get 3 quick item slots, but as you'll soon find out, those item slots are basically always going to be filled with the same 3 items. So, anytime you have the Kira status effect, you have to go through a couple menus. It breaks up the gameplay far too much. I would be more inclined to forgive the game for this and just write it off as a byproduct of an early 2000s RPG, but it's clear to me the dev team was aware of this. Using item repair again as an example, there is an item in Dark Cloud you can assign to your quick item slot that automatically repairs a weapon when it's about to break. This certainly helps the overall flow of the game, but the fact that the devs noticed this issue and instead of fixing it just made another item is beyond irritating. Another issue with Dark Cloud is the overall size of the dungeons and how slow you move. Again, the devs noticed this and added an item that's sole purpose is to make you move quicker. I wish they would have just made floors smaller instead. Each floor layout is randomly generated as well, so sometimes the map I got worked out just fine, and other times I found myself having to backtrack. The weapon upgrade system has a few issues with it as well. Once a weapon is ready to level up, it stops gaining experience. This doesn't sound like a problem, but when you consider you need certain items to strengthen a weapon, there are moments when you cannot upgrade in a meaningful way if you don't have the items needed. This leads to everyone's favorite activity in video games, grinding. On this, Dark Cloud does have a system that makes grinding a bit easier. Each floor has a back floor you can travel to that has tough enemies that give more experience and a high chance of getting quality items for weapon upgrades. But a grind is still a grind. When it comes to upgrading weapons, the best way is to level up a different weapon, and once it reaches a certain point, that weapon can be fused to your main one. The issue with that is most weapons you find or purchase aren't going to do the damage needed for the current dungeon you're on. So, the easiest way to level up other weapons is to build up your main weapon, kill an enemy, and right before the death animation finishes, switch your equipped weapon to the one you're leveling up. This of course means more time navigating menus instead of playing and can get pretty annoying. Weapons also break. I don't mean they break and then you can repair them. I mean if they break, they're gone forever. It's a pretty hefty penalty for simply not paying attention. I don't really consider this a flaw per se, but more of an annoyance given everything else. Plus, this was before autosave was the norm in video games. So if you want to save your weapon after it breaks and aren't saving regularly, a good chunk of time may be wasted. The last and probably most forgiving negative is how all 6 of the characters function. Usually a character gets added to your party around the time you get stuck in a dungeon. Not only does each character use a different weapon, but they also assist with traversal in dungeons. Goro can use his hammer to open certain doors, Zhao can jump across holes in the ground, and so on. It sounds good on paper, but in game, this gets tedious. This problem overlaps with my issues with floor layouts and time spent in menus. I would sometimes be playing with a certain character, come across an obstacle, switch to the corresponding character to get across it, and switch back to the character I was using, only to find a different obstacle requiring a different character around the corner. There is one character who's kind of an exception to this rule, and that's Osmond. Osmond is the last party member you get in Dark Cloud, and he's without a doubt the best one. As I mentioned before, Osmond flies around maps. He can fly over the same obstacles you would otherwise need Zhao to jump across, except he can do it without locking into a cutscene. A couple other things to note with Osmond. Although he uses guns, they function a bit differently. Osmond has access to machine guns that fire quickly, laser pistols which fire slower but do more damage per shot than machine guns, and grenade launchers. All other characters basically have one type of weapon and one type of moveset. Osmond has 3. He also has more of an impact on the main story than any other side character. Towards the end of the game, I only wanted to use Osmond and Toan. The other characters are fine and fun to mess around with, but Osmond is clearly the best long-range option and Toan is the main character and most balanced melee option. I felt like at the end of the game, I was only using the other 4 characters when I was forced to. Dark Cloud certainly isn't a flawless game, and the older it gets, the more dated it feels compared to what I expect with modern video games. That isn't a bad thing though. Sometimes it's nice to play an older game to appreciate the risks they were able to take and how far we've come since. I've played through it several times in the 20 years it's been out, and I've never found anything quite like it. On one hand, weapon upgrading, city building, and dungeon crawling function just fine but still have room to grow. On the other hand, the menu-heavy gameplay, almost zero quality of life aspects, too many playable characters, and larger-than-needed dungeons add a lot of bloat to a game that's already pretty long. 2 years after Dark Cloud released, we got a sequel. Dark Cloud 2 is one of my favorite video games of all time and does what a sequel should: build on what works and rework or take out what doesn't. Although it isn't perfect, it's still a leap forward from the first game. I 100% believe the devs took a look at Dark Cloud and focused on making a better game, and they succeeded. I don't know if this was intentional or not, but Dark Cloud 2 begins where Dark Cloud 1 ended. Not literally exactly, but certainly symbolically. Dark Cloud 1 ends with Toon traveling back in time to stop the Dark Genie from ever being born. In the final scene of Dark Cloud, Toon stops an assassination attempt and saves the king and his family. In Dark Cloud 2, Monica, one of the playable characters, witnesses her father being assassinated. The game then cuts to a young boy named Max who works at a machine shop. The circus is in town and he wants to get his work done so he can take part in the festivities. After a brief scene showing how good of a boy Max is, he finally gets to the circus. He learns the circus troupe is a front to find a mysterious red stone that just so happens to be in Max's possession. Max escapes the troupe and sets out on a journey to figure out the mystery of the red stone and what's going on in the outside world. Max meets Monica, who's a royal princess from the future. She possesses a blue stone that's identical to Max's red stone. The outside world was destroyed in the past and is affecting Monica's future. So Max and Monica have to rebuild the present to fix the future to find out how they can travel to the past to stop Emperor Griffin from destroying the world in the past. Yeah. The plot of Dark Cloud 2 is much more involved than the first game, and to be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of the story in 2. But just like the first game, I think it's just fine. It's about what I'd expect from a story to be from this era of video games. Also new to the story is voice acting and more production overall. The cutscenes are also much longer and more frequent. So if you're the type of person that likes cheesy action RPG plots from the PS2 era, you'll feel right at home with Dark Cloud 2's story. It's a lot more exposition heavy, and the time travel elements kind of make the story not make any sense, but I was able to suspend my disbelief and enjoy it. Dungeon crawling and combat have been overhauled. The first thing one may notice is Max has both a melee and ranged option. Max uses the wrench or hammer in one hand, like Goro, and a gun in the other hand, like Osmond. Monica has two as well. She uses swords like Toon and magic like Ruby. Compared to Dark Cloud, you're getting two characters in one and don't have to switch between characters for close and long range options. Combat is a bit more polished as well. Forward X now does a lunging attack. Backwards X does a backflip dodge. You can block attacks as well. Now different weapon types have different movesets. Max uses wrenches that attack quickly with a long combo, and he uses large hammers which tend to do more damage but slower and with a shorter combo. Monica can rapid fire magic or charge it up, and her swords work similar to Max's weapons with fast and slow combos. Monica also gets an ability exclusive to her where she can absorb elemental magic through blocking and fire it back at monsters. The refined combat changes the overall flow of the game. It's quicker and gives the player more options without the menu clutter of Dark Cloud 1. New options were added in as well. One's really cool and the other I could do without. Max gets access to a ride pod. The ride pod is fully customizable and was a nice addition. Monica gets access to this monster transformation mechanic that I never really liked or found useful. It's forgettable, and throughout every playthrough since the game's release, I've only ever used it on the one time you're required to in the story. All of these options are just a click of the thumbstick away too. It's much easier to switch between your combat options in Dark Cloud 2 than it was in Dark Cloud 1. Most of the annoying survival elements were taken out of Dark Cloud 2. When your weapons break, you no longer lose them forever. They just stop doing damage until you repair them. The thirst meter was thrown out completely, so all you really have to do is keep an eye on health and status effects. Menus are set up better, and navigation through them is easier. One aspect of Dark Cloud 1 I didn't like was not fixed in 2, and in fact I think was made worse. For whatever reason, floors and dungeons are now even larger. Although the game itself is more smooth and fast-paced, I felt at times that it didn't feel like it because of the levels being way too big. It's baffling to me because the devs did go in and make more quality of life improvements. Each dungeon now has a map of the floors, and you get some basic information before you move on to the next floor, and it's easier to track your progress throughout the dungeons. The dungeons look nice too. Just like with 1, Dark Cloud 2's towns and dungeons have a lot of character and charm to them. My favorite location is probably Venicio. You get to build a beachside town, and the dungeon goes back and forth between being in an ocean cave and being outside on the beach. Clearly, love and care were put into revamping the dungeons. I just wish they were a bit more compact, or even some sort of way to teleport to the exit when you were finished with the level. Just like with combat, Dark Cloud 2 adds new things to do in the dungeons. Most levels have side objectives per floor. There's a new minigame called Sfida. This is a golf minigame that opens up after you clear a floor, and if you get the ball in the hole, you get a prize. The fishing minigame from Dark Cloud 1 gets expanded. Dungeons have fishing goals. You can race fish in an aquarium and race them. They added a general fishing contest. Each dungeon floor has your more standard side objectives like kill all the enemies by X time or use a certain weapon type, or complete the floor without healing. There is no shortage of content in Dark Cloud 2. The weapon upgrading system is back and better than ever. In fact, Dark Cloud 2 might have one of my favorite weapon progression systems ever. Just like in Dark Cloud 1, you build up and transform your weapons, but this time it's much easier and player friendly. You now find upgrade materials everywhere because everything can be used as an upgrade material. In fact, sometimes it's more effective to use random items to upgrade your weapons than actual items put in the game for weapon upgrades. When your weapon levels up, it just moves on to the next level, still gaining experience. So, if you don't have what you need to upgrade your weapon, you can store up experience points for when you do have them. I never really felt like my time was being wasted when it came to building up my weapons in 2. When I started replaying Dark Cloud 2, I sort of forgot about this and wanted to grind out my weapons immediately. But it turns out this isn't necessary and kind of a waste of time. More often than not, if your weapons aren't gaining levels quickly, it's time to move on because the dungeon after the one you're currently on will give you more experience. Also, the weapon upgrades are pretty cool looking, and some of the weapons are callbacks to the first game. City building is back too, and it's all new and kind of improved. It's more DIY and customizable this time around. Instead of finding people trapped in orbs and rebuilding a town or city, Max and Monica now have to recruit people from Palm Brinks to move into areas. Once you have people moved in, you follow a list of what the town needs to be put back together. During this process, the future changes and you can time travel to see what your changes actually affected. This is all nice and it does give the player more agency on how towns are built, and I got into it with a few of the maps. However, with more customization available, the flaws with the city building are more visible. My idea for a perfect town could not come to fruition because the game simply wouldn't let me. There is a limit to how much stuff can be placed on a map, so some of my towns ended up just meeting the minimum requirements to 100% the area. All the tools are there to make something pretty unique and interesting, but the game never gives you the space or motivation to do so. Some of my towns look like absolute crap, but the game says I 100% met all the requirements. In Dark Cloud 1, 100% looked like you truly rebuilt a destroyed town. While I think 2 is moving in the right direction, they did not implement it very well. I suspect this is more due to the PS2 hardware limitations than any sort of dev incompetence. For the most part, Dark Cloud 2 is a more realized version of the first one, and that's how a sequel should be, really. After playing both games again, I truly believe it had franchise potential. Unfortunately, Dark Cloud 2 is the last game we got. I find this a bit perplexing. When I say franchise potential, I'm not just talking about how good the games are. The games are standalone in plot, but they both share elements that lead me to believe Level 5 was trying to build towards a long-running game series. A few things led me to this conclusion. There are callbacks to Dark Cloud 1 and 2. Gameplay elements, sure, but there's more to it than that. Monsters in 1 appear in 2. Plot points like time travel and Atlamillia are used in both games. Even characters from 1 are revisited in 2. Remember when I said Osmond was by far the best character in the first game? Osmond appears in Dark Cloud 2, and again has a bigger role than most non-main characters in the story. Bosses in 1 were made into characters in 2. Dark Cloud 1 and 2 even share big set pieces and story moments. It seems to me like Dark Cloud was supposed to be something bigger than what we got. It also appears to me that both Dark Cloud 1 and 2 were universally loved at the time they were released in the States. Metacritic shows Dark Cloud at a solid 80 and Dark Cloud 2 at an 87. I think Level 5 had a winner on their hands. But that's not how it turned out. I've talked to many of my gamer friends about the two Dark Cloud games in the 20 years since they've came out. Probably more than they ever cared to hear about a PS2 game they vaguely remember. But something happened a few years ago. A game called Ni no Kuni 2 was about to be released and a friend sent me the trailer. The most noticeable thing about the trailer for me was the developer, Level 5. So I got a little curious about what they've been up to since the Dark Cloud days. Turns out they've made a ton of successful games. Nothing I was too interested in, but that's okay. It's nice to see a dev team responsible for making two of my favorite games continue to grow and succeed. By the looks of it though, we aren't going to get another Dark Cloud game. Level 5 has three hugely successful IPs with Professor Layton, Yokai Watch, and the aforementioned Ni no Kuni. I came across an interview with Level 5's CEO saying he'd be interested in Dark Cloud 3, but the franchise is owned by Sony Entertainment. Licensing hell is real. Dark Cloud 3 is still my dream revival. Both 1 and 2 are great games, and although some parts did not age well, they're still unique and exceptionally creative. I see elements of Dark Cloud in games I enjoy today. I truly believe Level 5 was ahead of their time, and it's a shame that all of that potential will most likely fade into obscurity. That said, I wouldn't believe that in 2021 I would be playing Dark Cloud 1 and 2 on my PlayStation 5. If there's one thing I'm certain about, it's how uncertain the gaming industry can be. Anything can be revived, anything can be rebooted, anything can get a sequel. I just hope that one day it's Dark Cloud. Thanks for watching.